right here, it's called a slacker stack, officially in the wood turning world. Every wood turner I know has one. We get these pristine scores of great wood. We set aside, we're gonna rough it out and get it all prepped so that it will dry out perfectly and we can make some really awesome things out of it. We just can't throw it away. We can't throw it to waste. Let's just set aside. We'll get you it really quickly so it doesn't go bad. And then months later, we got a pile of wood that's all cracked and basically is fuel now. Why is it called a slacker stack? Because every time you pass by it, it calls out, slacker, slacker, slacker. Well, let's stick it on the lathe and see how much of this we can save. So, after going through that entire slack pile, this is all I've got left. Just a bunch of sawdust and a bunch of little tubes. Time to paint the ends and put them up on the drying rack. So there you go. My process for roughing out. Am I in focus? Close enough. My process for roughing out bowl blanks and spindle turning. Wood turning is one of those cool niches of woodworking that once you make the capital investment to buy the tools, namely your lathe, your gouges, I always say you need a bandsaw and a chainsaw if you're going to do this. Once you make that investment, you really don't have to make much more of a capital investment to make as much as you want. These kind of tools don't really wear out, and the wood's free. You can find it on Craigslist, the side of the roads, after storms, just driving down the street, you probably see something falling over. A lot of times past customers of mine, because I tell them, will call me when something falls down the backyard. And basically I'll return a few bowls for taking from the foot above the ground to the second branch and getting it off their hands. Now, I roughed out two different kinds of things here. I did some spindle roughing and I did some bowl roughing. Spindle roughing is basically when the tree grows straight up and down. If you turn it on its side and spin it with the grain, that's spindle turning, and basically you rough it out to a cone, to a cylinder. Now, sometimes you can just do it on the bandsaw and leaves little squares, but physics-wise, it will dry faster if you turn it into a sphere, because a sphere, the moisture goes out evenly. If you got a square, there are certain sides of it that's not even. So the cylinder will dry a little bit quicker. And if you know you're going to be turning in a cylinder eventually anyways, hey, why not start out with a cylinder? Now, with that one, with spindle roughing, you can use a spindle rough and gouge, or some people just call them straight roughing gouges, but you never want to use that tool when you're roughing out a bowl. You know, on a bowl, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, the tree grows straight up and down. What we will do is we will put it against the lathe sideways, and basically we turn the tree like this. So you're going with the grain and against the grain twice every single revolution. So it's a lot of resistance, less resistance, resistance, less resistance. And because a lot of roughing gouges, spindle roughing gouges, that is the term they're trying to get us to all use nowadays, because they are based on a flat piece of metal that's curved up, that tang is flat, they can actually bend, break, spin around, stick in your neck, and kill everybody. So you never want to use a spindle roughing gouge when you're roughing out a bowl or even turning a bowl. Now, this is also one of those things that if you get skilled at one aspect of roughing, it makes the other stages go a lot quicker, the later stages. If you're very good with a chainsaw, making sure you get a nice flat base, it sure does make it a lot easier to bandsaw out a circle. I always bandsaw out the circle because A, you can get a bigger bowl on a smaller or a medium-sized lathe. This one I'm using is just a 16-incher, so that's the maximum I can go. And if if you cut out a square and stick it on the lathe, you know, the biggest you can end up with is about a 12-inch because those corners hit the bed rails. So if you're going to bandsaw out the maximum size circle you can, having a flat base at the right angle to the grain really does make the job a lot easier. And also, a lot of woodworkers, when they see a turner using the bandsaw, they freak out. Understand, we are setting the bandsaw up to turn rough blanks in green wood. You typically use a 3/8 to 1/2 inch blade with a skip tooth, maybe 3 or 4 TPI or even lower. It's very aggressive, and the set on the blades is a lot more than a typical blade. It is a rough cutting tool, and you never want to use a bandsaw blade that you have already roughed out bowls on for fine work or resawing or anything like that, because it's going to be trashed. The teeth are going to be all bent, which is perfectly fine for what we are doing here, but for fine work, you just don't want to do that. So I always have a separate blade for my green turning in roughing out. Now, a lot of people, when they see a turner using the bandsaw, they freak out because it looks like we're going to be going straight in the blade, but if you watch closely how we do it, we're always on a twisting motion around the blade. We are never pushing towards the blade. So even if our hands slip, it's going out to the side or something like that. We are going around in a circle trying to pivot on a certain spot. And you focus on feeding into the front of the blade, feeding it straight in. You're not moving it sideways. And if you notice the blades, when somebody that knows what they're doing, the blade's not bending quite a bit. It's not actually putting a lot of stress on the blade when you do it right. Now, if you've done a good job with your chainsaw and you've done a good job with the bandsaw, it makes lining up the grain, meaning getting it somewhat centered in the bowl, a lot easier. But if you haven't done it, there are ways I explained in that past video on how to adjust the grain so it will look properly at that time. It just takes a little bit more work. I didn't do it very much adjusting here. I basically put it between centers, I put a tenon on it, I put it in the chuck, I turned out the center. On some of them you saw me using a hollowing jig to hollow out the center section instead of just turning it out, and I will discuss that in a lot more detail in a future video. Now there are basically two different styles of turning at this point. You can do green turning where you are going straight to the finished size, finished shape of the bowl. Typically, I think that's kind of a boring design because when you are rough turning, when you're turning green wood, you have to concentrate on getting it very even all the way through. Because if you have it thicker in one spot and thinner in another, basically when the bowl starts to warp, there'll be more pressure in one area than the other, and you'll end up getting cracks. So if you're turning green, it has to be thin, and it has to be very even with no decorations on it, or very, very, very minimal decorations on it. And if you notice, this bowl right here, which I did in that video, going from the tree to a bowl and day, it is no longer round either this way or this way. It is basically a football shape. Now, if you want something just dead flat perfect, which I hate to say it, most people do want nowadays when you're going to markets. I guess they're so associated with ceramics being perfectly flat. That's what they pay the most money for. That or natural edge bowls is what they really like. But if you want dead flat and you want to add different shapes, different curves and stuff, well then you have to have a dead dry bowl that isn't going to move that much. And how you do that one is you turn it fairly thickly but very evenly all the way around. That way as it dries and warps, there's no pressure in one area or the other, as I stated earlier. You can then take that bowl 6 months to a year later, stick that on the lathe, and turn in the way that warping, and then feel it, make sure it's dry. If it's still a little bit wet, or you can tell by the shavings and stuff like that, stick that back up in your attic or on your shelf for another 6 months or a year, and then coming back. That's generally called twice or thrice turning something, and you can get very nice shapes that way that will stay consistently round over a long period of time. Now, how thick you make it is very variable. A lot of it has to do with the species of the wood, where it grew up, and your ecology or the weather in your area. I'm in Austin, Texas. We are on the border between desert of West Texas and the subtropics of the Houston area. So we occasionally get lots of rain coming in, and then it might be dry forever. And typically our trees absorb a lot of water and they hold a lot of water, but they don't grow very fast. So we get kind of gnarly wood that has a lot of water in it, but it might be very dry at sometimes too. So it tends to move quite a bit. So I had to do a different technique than somebody that's like in a rainforest area where it's always wet, or somebody that's where it's always in the dry area. Now, general rule of thumb is if you have a 10-inch bowl across, you do 10%, 1 inch. If you're doing a 20-inch bowl, you would do 2 inches thick. And that will allow for enough warpage that when you turn away the warpage, there will still be some bowl left. But take that with a grain of salt and adjust it with experience on your area and the type of species you're doing. Now, after you rough turn it, you gotta slow down the drying process from water coming out of the end grain. And the best thing to do is put in a wax finish. What do they call that? Anchor Seal is a very good brand out there. It's kind of pricey and it's out of my price pot. Yeah, I didn't have anything, so I just used oil-based paint. And you want to try and use a glossy finish because it's got a lot more solids in it. It'll slow the water coming in and out a little bit. Sometimes with paints, if you're using really punky woods like I had today, I mean, I don't really do punky woods that often. That was really punky today. It's going to absorb quite a bit, and you might have to put a couple coats on there. The downside of paint, and something I really hate about it, is when you do have punky woods where there might be some bark inclusion, stuff like that, the paint gets in those areas, and when you turn it off, there's paint in there, so then you have to scrape it out, and it just doesn't look natural anymore. That's where the wax is really nice, because you can kind of heat up the wax and melt it out, and it'll look really good, and it looks kind of finished that way. If you have a local wood turning club, a lot of times the clubs will buy a big 55-gallon drum of that Anchor Seal stuff, and you can buy it from them for 15-20 bucks a gallon. But getting it from Amazon or one of the woodworking stores, it can get, $40 to $60 after you can include shipping and stuff and their markups. So it's kind of pricey. I just go buy some cheap stuff if I have to. I was using some paint from the sign I made today. So I hope you enjoyed this video, maybe learned something. I enjoy making them, but remember one thing, I am trying to earn a living at doing this kind of stuff, and we do this so that we can sell our own bowls or boxes or something like that. And granted, you might be a wood turner and want to make your own bowls, that's why you're watching this video, but we also a lot of times sell shop-made tools or antique tools I have, or other areas of woodworking like boxes and stuff like that, that might be a good gift for one of your family or friends. And it would help us out quite a bit. You can go to wortheffort.com, look at our store, and we have other ways you can patronize us there too. Now I want you to remember one last thing. It is always worth the effort to learn, create, and share with others. Oh, and that drawing you saw right there, that'll be another t-shirt design that we'll have in our store, kind of like this one. I'll probably put the images on back with our logo on the front on the upcoming batches. Y'all be safe and have fun.